How many times have you thought your job was the absolute worst? Sure, the daily grind can be exhausting, but trust me, your 9 to 5 is a dream compared to some of the horrifying jobs people had in the Middle Ages. Not everyone was peacefully farming or herding cattle. Some had jobs so disgusting and downright disturbing that your worst workday would feel like a vacation. From shoveling human waste to handling horrors you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy, these medieval professions were not for the faint of heart. Fair warning, if you're eating, you might want to put that fork down. Now, let's dive into the nastiest jobs in history. The tanner. Now there's a job that was absolutely essential in medieval times, even if it wasn't exactly the most glamorous. You see, leather was the backbone of medieval life. Need shoes? Leather. A sturdy belt? Leather. Armor for the knights? Yep, leather. Saddle for horses? You guessed it, leather. And who made all this possible? The tanner. This was the person who took raw, smelly animal hides and turned them into something usable, durable, and downright indispensable. But let's be clear, this wasn't just a matter of tossing a hide into a large tank or container and walking away. Tanning was a complex, labor-intensive process that required skill, patience, and a strong stomach. First, the hides had to be cleaned thoroughly. This meant scraping off all the flesh, fat, and hair, which was as messy and unpleasant as it sounds. Then came the tanning process itself. Hides were soaked in a series of solutions, often made from natural materials like tannin, which came from tree bark or even animal brains. Yes, brains. Sometimes urine was used too. The hides would sit in these solutions for weeks, sometimes months, to ensure they were properly preserved and softened. And let's not forget the physical labor. If you've handled or carried a few wet jeans, you know what I mean. These hides were heavy, waterlogged, and foul-smelling. So we can say that a tanner's job wasn't the most pleasant one. Imagine a mix of rotting flesh, chemicals, and dampness. Yikes! But here's the thing, tanners were absolutely vital. Without them, medieval society would have fallen apart. No exaggeration. They supplied the materials for countless everyday items, from the humble cobbler's shoes and the farmer's gloves to the nobleman's armor and the scribe's parchment. Even bookbinders relied on tanners for leather covers, and saddlers needed their expertise to craft durable horse gear. Leather was also used for belts, pouches, scabbards, and even some types of medieval furniture. So while the job might have been dirty, smelly, and downright unpleasant, it was also deeply respected. Tanners often worked in designated areas outside town walls due to the odor, but their guilds were powerful, and their trade was protected by strict regulations. In medieval times, the role of the executioner was both essential and stigmatized. He was tasked with carrying out public capital punishments through methods such as hanging, beheading, and other forms of corporal punishment. Despite the necessity of their work, they often faced social exclusion due to the nature of their duties. Becoming an executioner was rarely a voluntary career choice. This position was mostly hereditary, passed down through families, creating lineages of executioners. Others were former criminals offered the position as an alternative to their own death sentences. For instance, Thomas Derrick, an English sailor convicted of rape, was pardoned on the condition that he become an executioner. He accepted and went on to execute over 3,000 people, including, ironically, the Earl of Essex in 1601, who had granted him the pardon. The job required a steady hand and a strong constitution. Executioners were expected to carry out sentences swiftly to minimize the suffering of the condemned. Any mishap could lead to prolonged agony, bringing additional shame upon the executioner. They also lived on the fringes, both socially and geographically, due to the fear and superstition surrounding their profession. In medieval England, before the advent of modern plumbing, managing human waste was, as you can imagine, a pretty nasty challenge. Everybody needs to go to the loo, and without proper plumbing systems, where does all the waste go? Communities relied on cesspits and privies to collect excrement. But without proper sanitation infrastructure, these waste repositories would quickly fill up, leading to foul odors and potential health hazards. To combat this, towns would employ people who had the job of clearing out people's waste, and they were called Gong Farmers. This job was absolutely necessary because, without it, towns would have been drowning in their own filth. The term gong originates from the Old English word for going, a rather polite reference to bodily functions. Gong farmers were tasked with the job of cleaning out cesspits and privies. Sometimes they would have to descend into these places to collect material, mostly at nighttime, and be met with obnoxious gases. Gong farmers would haul carts or barrels through the streets, collecting waste from cesspits and transporting it outside of the city walls. The waste wasn't just dumped though, it was often sold to farmers as fertilizer. Some gong farmers were paid by the town council, while others worked freelance, charging households for their services. Despite the essential nature of their job, gong farmers were social outcasts, often forced to live on the outskirts of town and barred from entering certain public spaces. Gong farmers did the dirty work and had to dig through filth. Thankfully, all you have to do is tap the like and subscribe button. No gloves required, I promise. There you go. Thanks a lot. Now let's continue. Believe it or not, the treadmill operator was a real job in medieval times. And no, it had nothing to do with fitness. Back then, a treadmill or tread wheel was a massive wooden wheel used for heavy lifting, powered by human or animal effort. In those times, everybody was trying to build massive multi-story cathedrals or castles for some reason. So for that, there weren't any cranes available. Instead, these massive human-powered tread wheels were used to bring up the building materials like stone, marble, water buckets, etc. By simply walking, operators could lift loads weighing 13,000 pounds. The idea was simple. An operator would walk inside the mill and it would turn, winding up a rope that lifted materials. This human-powered system was essential for constructing the towering structures that defined medieval skylines. The treadmill itself was a marvel of medieval engineering, often standing over 10 feet tall and requiring immense physical strength to operate. Workers would climb inside the wheel, much like a hamster in a cage, and walk in place to generate power. But one wrong step and you could fall under the moving wheel and mushed up right there. Or worse, fall from the dizzying height. Despite the dangers, treadmill operators were indispensable. Their labor powered the construction of iconic structures, some of which still stand today. The next time you're fascinated by a medieval cathedral or castle, remember the brave souls who walked the wheels. Back in the day, when doctors believed that draining some blood could cure all sorts of ailments, leeches were the go-to medical tool. Yeah, real, living leeches. But someone had to gather those slippery little creatures, and that's where leech collectors came in. These folks would wade into marshes, bogs, and ponds, often rolling up their pants and using their own legs as bait. Leeches would latch on, and once they had their fill, the collectors would pluck them off and store them for sale to doctors and apothecaries. It was a messy and uncomfortable job, not to mention the risk of infections from multiple bites. Some collectors even used old horses to attract leeches, sparing themselves from becoming a human buffet. The demand for leeches was so high in the 19th century that natural populations started to dwindle. In response, places like the Bedale Leech House in North Yorkshire were established to store and keep leeches healthy until they were needed. These facilities ensured a steady supply for medical use. While the idea of using leeches might make us cringe today, leech collectors played a crucial role in the medical practices of their time, ensuring doctors had the tools they believed necessary to treat patients. During the Black Death in the 14th century, Europe faced an unprecedented health crisis, with the plague wiping out an estimated 25 to 60% of the population. In a normal scenario, there would be a proper burial service at church. But during the plague, cities were overwhelmed by the sheer number of deaths, leading to the emergence of plague barriers, who were tasked with the grim responsibility of collecting and burying the dead. Plague barriers navigated through streets with their carts and someone, mostly an old lady, who would examine the dead body. They would make rounds of streets calling out for people to bring out their dead and put one body over another on the cart. Once collected, the bodies were taken to mass graves, commonly called plague pits. These pits were often located on the outskirts of town to prevent further spread of the disease. In some cases, hundreds or even thousands of bodies were buried together. For example, recent excavations in Nuremberg, Germany uncovered a mass grave that might be the largest ever found in Europe, containing the remains of at least 1,000 plague victims. Payment for this grim work varied. Some plague buriers were paid per body, while others received a flat fee from the town council. Many were desperate individuals, like criminals, beggars, or those with no other options, who risked their lives for meager wages. The job was incredibly dangerous, as plague buriers were constantly exposed to the disease. Unsurprisingly, their life expectancy was short. So tell me, which of these medieval jobs was the most disturbing for you? Write it down below. Now check out this video on the screen about the medieval toilet situation, and trust me, it's going to shock you to the core. I'll see you there.